before I begin my homily, can we all acknowledge something together? Following Jesus can be hard, very hard. And it's important for us to recognize that. And so if you're struggling in your faith right now, you're struggling with kind of keeping it all together, and if you feel overwhelmed, let me declare this to you. It's okay that it's hard. It's okay that it's difficult. When I was a young priest, a mentor of mine came up to me and said, just want you to know that it's okay that the priesthood is hard. I'm like, really? Because sometimes we think that we're doing it wrong if we struggle, right? But it's okay that it's hard. In fact, in some sense, it's supposed to be. This is what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel. He says, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So before we talk about what it means to, the suffering that is entailed in following Jesus, it's important for us to take a step back and say, what is he talking about, coming after him? Whoever wishes to come after me, right? So if Jesus is preaching the kingdom of God, he's talking about his Father's house. He's talking about the reign of God, right? He's talking about going to where he's going. We need to recognize he's talking about heaven. Whoever wishes to come after me, to follow me, to learn from me, and to live with me forever in eternity, that person must choose to follow me. And so it's important right now to acknowledge, before I talk about this discipleship, who of us wants to go to heaven? Raise your hand if you want to go to heaven. Some of you are not raising your hands. I can always tell who's not paying attention when I have this kind of inner homily poll going on. But we all want to go to heaven. So how do we get there? What is it that we must do? Jesus says very clearly, we must take up our cross. We must deny ourselves and take up our cross. And with the suffering that Jesus is talking about is not just any suffering. The truth is that everyone suffers. Believers and unbelievers alike. Christians and unchristians, or people who aren't Christians alike. Everyone suffers. We live in a lost and broken world with suffering and death and sickness. But what Jesus is talking about here is a particular kind of suffering. It's the suffering that we experience on account of our yes to God, on account of us trying to be faithful to him, on account of us trying to love our neighbor, trying to love him above all things. It's the suffering of faith and the suffering of love. It's the suffering that comes when we seek to witness to him to a world around us that doesn't believe. Jesus is saying, this is the kind of suffering you must be willing to endure. This is the kind of suffering you must persevere in. And one of the things that convicts me or strikes me about discipleship is that the yes to choosing to follow him isn't just a one-time yes in our life. It needs to be a yes that we continually make in order to follow him. Because after all, one thing that I often preach on, for those of you who are guests, you don't know this is kind of a theme of my preaching. After all, we cannot accidentally get to heaven any more than we can accidentally graduate from college, any more than we can accidentally get married. We must make a decision once and every single day of our lives to persevere. This is important because, I say this for two reasons. One, if we're tempted to give up, if we're tempted to kind of throw in the towel, like I can't do this Jesus thing, I can't do this Christianity thing. If we're tempted to give up, it's important for us to remember that we can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, expect us to follow Jesus through his cross to the resurrection and at the same time deny the very way by which we get there. That is self-denial and suffering, the suffering of love and faith. We can't really have it both ways, right? Because sin itself is the rejection of God. It's the rejection of his mercy. It's the rejection of the only one that can save us. And this is important for us as we think about those who no longer practice their faith. In a real sense, they're in a very precarious situation. If you ask them, do you want to go to heaven? Do you believe that you're going to go to heaven? They might say yes, but at the same time, they're rejecting the King of heaven. And so, on the one hand, we need to remember that if we're tempted to give up, just to acknowledge, okay, I can't have it both ways. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, if you may, to make sure that we're focused on what discipleship is all about. But the second reason why I say this is that I think it's really important for us to remember that we cannot follow Jesus on our own. He never asked us to. We cannot follow him on our own. Now, last year, as the pastor, I talked about a vision that we have for discipleship here at St. Patrick, and we unveiled what's called the Discipleship Pathway, which is essentially a comprehensive pastoral strategy to get all of us who are in different places in our faith to following Jesus on the path to heaven. right? And this pathway actually is geared toward people in all different areas of their faith, because we're not naive to think that everyone's in the same place in their relationship with Jesus. In fact, as I preach today, I know that some of you are very mature in your faith. You have made an intentional decision to follow Jesus and surrendered your life and faith to him. And at this moment in your life, this season in your life, you're growing in spiritual maturity. You're growing in your faith, right? But I also know that there are some of you who are probably barely here. Maybe your mom and dad kind of dragged you here. Maybe your friend has invited you here. Maybe you're not even sure if God is real. Maybe you're not even sure if Jesus is who he says he is. And then there are other people who are here who know who Jesus is. They believe in him, but they're struggling to make that decision to follow him every day of their life. Or maybe they haven't really made the decision to follow him with giving their lives to him. And so there's a struggle. But the key of our discipleship pathway is that every single one of us has a way here at the parish to enter into this pathway, right? So to kind of back up, the church believes that the life of Christ is really the path to God. And the early Christians called the Christian life the way. It's actually they called it the way, like we're on the way, right? So the Greek word way means road or pathway. And so what we've decided to do at St. Pat's is to make sure that there's a way by which people can get on the pathway and can persevere on that pathway until they die to get to heaven. And so we have developed what's called on-ramps, right? People need to get on the road, so we have an on-ramp. And that is basically a process by which people hear the gospel. They learn about who Jesus is and what he asks of us, and they're given an opportunity to say yes to him. That's what we talk about with regard to Alpha. This is why we promote Alpha so much here. And so many of you have been a part of Alpha. You've renewed your own faith. And we're inviting people who aren't even Christian or maybe who've fallen away to come into that pathway so they can get on the on-ramp. So it's a very important part of it. The other thing that we talk about is that when you're on the way, it's really important for us to get rejuvenated and to rest and to refuel. So we talk about different rest stops, like on the way, right? And the rest stops could be something like the parish mission that I preached on prayer. It could be something like Called and Gifted, to learn and understand our gifts. Or it could be something like Faith and Science workshop that I gave last winter, which we learned about the distinction between faith and science and how they don't contradict and so on and so forth. Rest stops are simply ways by which we can grow in spiritual and intellectual maturity. But there's other parts of the way, but I want to just focus on one more part, and that is the transportation, if you may. It's illegal to try to travel the path of discipleship on our own, because if we do, we might not make it. So the key is that what we want to do here is we want to promote people traveling together, learning to grow in discipleship. And so we have processes that are kind of a bigger process to help people learn to grow in discipleship together. And that's with our women's ministry called Walking with Purpose and our men's ministry called That Man Is You. And the key is to bring people into these ministries to help develop relationships with each other so that they can continue on the path. But the point is not to build big ministries. This is really important. My desire is not so that we have hundreds and hundreds of people in the ministries, even though we may have that many now. My point is that as a result of these ministries, people get connected with each other and live the Christian life, sharing the life with each other and supporting each other. And that is what we call CARs, or small discipleship groups. It is my vision as a pastor that my parishioners are deeply connected with each other, supporting each other, where each of us is known and loved, where each of us is encouraged and live in hope that when we carry heavy burdens, we can carry them together. And that is really the goal of this. In fact, all Christian churches that are experiencing significant growth and are healthy, this is across the world and in the United States, have small Christian communities or small groups as an essential part of their plan. And this is one of the things that we are doing here at St. Pat's. It's very powerful. And as a pastor, I can tell you that it's really clear to me which Christians are supported and which ones aren't. Because I see a marked difference in how they understand their own path and how they understand the struggles that they have. And so those who are well supported, those who are known and loved and they're understood and they're kind of sharing it, you can see that there's a certain hope with regard to what they struggle with. It doesn't mean their lives are all together, right? It just means that there's a certain context of, I can do this, right? There's growth, there's freedom that's happening. I remember when I was on faculty at the seminary, you could tell which seminarians had a small discipleship group and which ones didn't. Which ones were part of a men's group in which guys shared the blessings and the difficulties, they prayed with each other, and which ones didn't. There were ones who had that, were well supported, they were open to formation, they were eager to grow, and there you started to see a lot more fruit in their life. Other people, they felt isolated, alone, they felt discouraged, and they had a hard time receiving from formation. And it's very similar to what happens in a parish. One of the things that was so moving for me recently, I was talking to a parishioner. She's a young adult. I think she's about 30 years old. She has an opportunity to move away, to go to be in a different state, to be with her husband who has an opportunity to have a different job. And she said, I cannot leave St. Pat's. There's no way. I have formed such close relationships, and I'm so well supported through walking with purpose. I have these friendships. I can't imagine me going anywhere else. I'm growing so much in my faith. And that's what happens when we're deeply connected with each other, which is all the more important to be living in a kind of an isolated, atomized culture that we have now. But what happens then when we try to live on our own? What happens when you try to do this without the presence of friends who deeply understand us and who are with us? What happens is we tend to get discouraged, we tend to get disillusioned, and we're tempted to give up. In fact, I would venture to say that a lot of people who no longer practice their faith never had that kind of support, and they gave up. It's too hard. On the other hand, if people don't give up, what they end up doing, they end up staying and they end up rationalizing their sin. They end up trying to justify their sin because they can't face their sin because they don't have the strength to actually deal with it. And as a result, both of these things that happen, when people choose to give up or they choose to rationalize their sin, are kind of anti-signs to those who don't believe. In other words, they're bad examples to those who don't believe around us. My brothers and sisters, if you hunger for more, if you hunger to be deeply connected to each other, I want to encourage you to look up our Discipleship Pathway on our website, to be involved in the men's group, to be involved in the women's ministry, to get involved in the different kinds of, we have overpasses, different events that we have that are open to other people that aren't even parishioners, to get involved so that you know that you're not alone and you never try to follow Jesus on your own. My brothers and sisters, denying ourselves for the sake of love seems impossible to the world. But when we know who we are and when we're connected with each other, we know that we're not seeking simply to build big ministries, but to build big people who are big in Christ. And when people see that, they're not going to be saying, oh, that's not attractive. They're going to be attracted to the Christian faith, not because they're looking at us, but they're looking at him in us.